The Dark Scrolls. The story of Catherine Carey begins in the restless heart of Tudor England, a world where power was fragile, where alliances shifted like quicksand, and where women's bodies were often measured not by their will, but by the children they could produce. Catherine was born in 1524, the daughter of Mary Boleyn, a woman who had once been the mistress of Henry VIII himself. From the very first breath she drew, Catherine's life was wrapped in whispers of scandal and speculation. Was she the daughter of William Carey, the loyal courtier who was officially her mother's husband? Or was she the secret child of the king, conceived in the shadows of an affair that history could not openly acknowledge? No one could prove it, and yet the rumor lingered like smoke, drifting through every room she ever entered. That air of mystery never quite left her, and it shaped the way others looked at her for the rest of her life. Catherine grew up in the dangerous shadow of the Boleyns. Her aunt, Anne Boleyn, would one day rise higher than almost any woman in English history, becoming queen and reshaping the kingdom itself. Her uncle, George Boleyn, moved boldly through court life. The family reached dazzling heights of influence, but Catherine, as a child, would live long enough to see the cost of such ambition. She would witness the downfall of Anne, her execution on Tower Green, and she would feel the fear that came when the headsman's blade cut not only through the neck of a queen, but also through the security of everyone who carried the Boleyn name. Catherine's bloodline was both a blessing and a curse. It opened doors, but it also placed her in constant danger. From an early age, she learned the lesson every Tudor woman had to absorb. Survival depended not on strength of arm, but on grace, obedience, and alliances formed through marriage. The body of a woman was rarely her own. It was a vessel for political strategy, a stage upon which men acted out their ambitions. By the time Catherine was a young woman, the question was not whether she would marry, but to whom she would be given. In 1540, she was wed to Francis Knollys, a man of reputation, loyalty, and political promise. The match was considered advantageous, aligning her with stability at a time when her Boleyn kin had fallen into disgrace. Yet, even within this union, Catherine knew her role: to bear children, to create a dynasty within a dynasty, to serve as the bridge between the power she had inherited and the future her husband desired. And bear children she did. 16 times Catherine carried life within her, and 16 times she endured the agony of childbirth, a trial that in Tudor England was one of the most dangerous ordeals any woman could face. Each pregnancy carried with it the possibility of death. Midwives were skilled, but medicine was primitive, and the line between joy and tragedy was agonizingly thin. Women whispered prayers as their bodies ached, not knowing whether they would ever rise again from the bed upon which they labored. Catherine survived more than most, but each survival came at a cost. The body weakened, the spirit frayed, and yet society looked upon her not with pity, but with expectation. To them, 16 children was not an ordeal. It was her duty fulfilled. Her children were not simply sons and daughters. They were pieces on the great chessboard of English politics. Each child carried with them the possibility of alliance, of service, of furthering the Knollys and Boleyn legacies. Catherine's eldest, Henry Knollys, grew into a figure of political importance, a man who would hold influence in the shifting landscape of Elizabethan England. William Knollys, another son, later rose to the title of Earl of Banbury, carving his place among the nobility. Francis Knollys the younger became known for his voice in Parliament, echoing the sharp intellect his mother carried, but could never fully display in her own right. And then there was Lettice Knollys, Catherine's daughter, who would one day marry Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, the great favourite of Elizabeth I. That marriage alone caused tremors across the court, for Elizabeth regarded Dudley as her closest companion, perhaps the one man she had truly loved. For her cousin Lettice to marry him was a wound that would never quite heal, and yet it was also proof of Catherine's role as mother to a brood that sat at the very center of the kingdom's fate. Every child was a thread in the fabric of history. Margaret Knollys, Elizabeth Knollys, Robert, Richard, Thomas, Anne, Catherine, each carried their own destiny, their own weight of expectation. Some lived long, prosperous lives. Others died young, as so many Tudor children did, claimed by illness, by accident, or by fate's cruel hand. For Catherine, there was little time to mourn or to rest, for as soon as one child was weaned, another was growing within her. The cycle was relentless, and it was the same for countless women of her time. What made Catherine's story remarkable was not only the number of children, but the way those children grew into the lifeblood of the Elizabethan court, serving as ladies-in-waiting, soldiers, politicians, and courtiers. They were her legacy, and yet they were also the chains that had bound her life. But Catherine's existence was not only about childbirth. She also found herself placed in the most intimate proximity to power. As chief lady of the bedchamber to Elizabeth I, she occupied a position few women ever reached. She attended to the Queen's daily life, her clothing, her chambers, her most private routines. To hold such a role was not merely to be a servant, it was to be a confidant, a silent witness to the moods and secrets of the monarch. Catherine and Elizabeth shared more than duty. They shared blood, or at least the possibility of blood. If the rumors were true, if Catherine had been fathered not by William Carey, but by Henry VIII himself, then Elizabeth and Catherine were half-sisters, bound by ties the world could not openly recognize. Perhaps this was why Elizabeth held her cousin so close, why she trusted her in ways she trusted few others. The Tudors thrived on secrets, and Catherine herself was a secret that walked, breathed, and lived in the Queen's presence every day. Behind the glamour of court life, however, Catherine carried the burdens of her gender and her age. The Tudor court was a place of spectacle, but beneath the silks and jewels lay constant danger. A wrong word, a misinterpreted glance, the rise of an enemy faction, all could mean ruin. For Catherine, the added strain of constant childbirth made her existence all the more precarious. 16 pregnancies meant 16 times her body was stretched to its limits. 16 times she faced the possibility of infection, hemorrhage, or fever. Some of her children were born strong and healthy, others frail and fragile. Some slipped away in infancy, mourned quietly in a society where child death was common but never less painful. Every child lost carved a scar deeper into her soul, but every child who lived bound her tighter to her duty. To understand Catherine is to understand the plight of women in Tudor England. Even noble women were not spared the brutal realities of their sex. Their lives were measured in dowries, in alliances, in wombs filled and emptied. A queen might wear a crown, but even she was judged by her ability to produce heirs. For women like Catherine, there was no escape from the cycle. Yet within that cycle, she managed to shape history. Her children became the sinews of the Elizabethan world. Her presence steadied the queen in times of solitude, and her loyalty placed her forever in the inner sanctum of Tudor power. She was both indispensable and invisible, praised for her fecundity, but seldom recognized for the strength it took to endure it. As the years passed, Catherine watched England shift around her. She had seen Henry VIII's tumultuous reign, the rise and fall of queens, the brief rule of Edward VI, the terror of Mary I, and finally the golden dawn of Elizabeth's reign. Through it all, she remained at the center, quietly but firmly fixed, a witness to revolutions of faith, to wars of succession, to the endless plotting of men who sought the throne. Her children grew into adulthood, forming their own alliances, stepping into roles that kept the Knollys family name etched into history. Her daughter Lettice, beautiful and ambitious, caused one of the greatest scandals of Elizabeth's court, when she married Robert Dudley in secret. It was a betrayal Elizabeth could not forgive, but it was also a reminder that the children Catherine had borne were not just her burden. They were now players in the very games of love and power that had once defined her own youth. By the time death came for Catherine in 1569, her body must have been weary beyond measure. She had given everything, her youth, her health, her strength, to her family, her husband, her queen. When news of her passing reached Elizabeth, the queen was said to be stricken with grief. She ordered that Catherine be buried in Westminster Abbey, an honor rarely granted to those outside the highest ranks of royalty. The funeral was conducted with solemn grandeur, a sign that Elizabeth mourned not just a cousin or a servant, but someone who had been an anchor in her life. It was as though in burying Catherine, Elizabeth was also burying a part of her own story, one tied to secrets, to whispers, and to unspoken truths. Catherine Carey's life is a reminder of the hidden stories that lie beneath the surface of history. She was more than a name in a family tree, more than the mother of 16 children, more than the chief lady of the bedchamber. She was a woman who endured the cruelties of her age, who carried in her womb the future of dynasties, who stood close to the throne, yet was forever at risk of being consumed by it. Her story forces us to confront the paradox of Tudor womanhood, celebrated for fertility, yet punished by its cost, exalted for loyalty, yet silenced by duty, remembered not for her own voice, but for the voices of the children she brought into the world. And yet, perhaps there is something hauntingly fitting in the way she is remembered. For in the end, the children she bore and the queen she served ensured that Catherine Carey would never be forgotten. Her bloodline stretched through the veins of courtiers, nobles, and statesmen, weaving into the fabric of England itself. Her name, once whispered with scandal, became a legacy written in the stones of Westminster, and her life, shaped by duty and endurance, continues to echo as a testament to the women of the Tudor world, women who suffered in silence, who sacrificed endlessly, and who, through their resilience, carried the weight of a kingdom upon their shoulders. The passing of Catherine Carey left behind more than the mourning of a queen. It left behind a legacy etched into flesh and blood, for she had carried within her the weight of 16 lives. Each child was both triumph and torment, a reminder of her endurance and the heavy price of womanhood in Tudor England. To understand her is to look not only at Catherine herself, but at the children she bore, for through them her story did not end. It continued to unfold long after her body had been laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. Her first child, Henry Knollys, came into the world when Catherine was still in the blush of youth, barely 20 years old. The labor was difficult, as most first births were, but Henry survived, a strong boy who would one day grow into a man of stature. For Catherine, the safe arrival of her firstborn was not only relief, but confirmation that she had fulfilled her duty as a wife. With Henry in her arms, she secured her place within the Knollys household and ensured that her husband's line would endure. But the ordeal of childbirth was a brutal initiation, one that left her shaken yet resigned to the reality that this was only the beginning of many such trials. Henry grew into a member of Parliament, a man whose career, though steady, never reached dazzling heights. Yet his presence in public life mattered, for each Knollys child who entered service strengthened the family's hold upon England's political sphere. Not long after, William Knollys was born, and with his arrival Catherine endured once again the agony of labor. The midwives guided her through hours of pain, and in the candle-lit chamber Catherine whispered prayers that her body would not betray her. William thrived, and his path carried him to titles and prominence. He would one day be created the Earl of Banbury, a mark of how the Knollys fortunes expanded. To Catherine, however, his infancy was not a title, but another endless succession of sleepless nights, of feeding, of quiet dread that fever or infection would snatch him away. It was a fear that clung to every Tudor mother, for the line between life and death for a child was unbearably thin. Francis Knollys the younger followed, another son destined for politics. Catherine's body bore the marks of strain with each new child. By the time Francis came, she had already known the weariness of a woman repeatedly drawn into childbirth. Yet she persisted, not because she had a choice, but because society demanded it. Francis became a prominent voice in the House of Commons, a fiery presence in the Elizabethan Parliament. His speeches rang with passion, and his career reflected the drive that must have flowed through the veins of his mother, even if Catherine herself was rarely given a platform to speak. Her daughter, Lettice Knollys, was born in the middle years, a girl whose beauty would one day provoke the wrath of a queen. When Catherine delivered Lettice, she perhaps did not imagine the storm her daughter would cause. For now she was simply a mother cradling her newborn, grateful to have survived yet another perilous night. Lettice grew into a woman of ambition, bold enough to marry Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who had long been the closest companion, perhaps even the true love, of Elizabeth I. That secret marriage drove a wedge between Lettice and the Queen, and Elizabeth never forgave her cousin for what she saw as betrayal. Yet, for Catherine, Lettice's life was proof that her children would not merely exist on the periphery. They would stand in the very heart of the court's most dangerous intrigues. The births continued, each one leaving Catherine more fragile, yet each one weaving another thread into the family tapestry. Margaret Knollys, born after Lettice, became a lady-in-waiting, her life tied to the Queen's service just as her mother's had been. Elizabeth Knollys, named in honor of her royal cousin, also took her place in the Queen's household, a visible reminder that Catherine's children were scattered across the court like chess pieces, always within sight of the monarch. Anne and Catherine, her other daughters, followed similar paths, weaving themselves into the intricate fabric of noble society, marrying, serving, carrying the family's influence forward. Each daughter was a pawn in the marriage market, but each also carried their mother's resilience, a quiet strength that belied the gilded cages they lived within. Robert Knollys, another of Catherine's sons, carved a career in politics and administration. Richard Knollys followed a similar course, proving once more that the Knollys line was not merely fertile, but politically entrenched. Thomas, her younger son, lived a shorter life, claimed by the harshness of an age where illness was merciless and death often struck without warning. For Catherine, the death of a child was a wound that never fully healed. She had given her body to bring him into the world, and to see that life extinguished was a torment that no mother could bear lightly. Yet she endured, as countless women endured, because there was no other choice. It is easy, centuries later, to speak of names, dates, and titles. But behind each one was a labor that tore through Catherine's body, a night of agony in which she clutched sheets and whispered prayers that she might live to see the dawn. Behind each child was blood, exhaustion, the hovering shadow of death. 16 times she walked through the valley of fear, and 16 times she emerged, sometimes battered, sometimes bereaved, but always bound by the expectations of her age. It is a wonder she lived as long as she did, for many women perished after only a handful of such ordeals. Catherine endured them all, as though sheer force of will kept her tethered to this world until her duty was complete. Her children became her political legacy. In Parliament, in noble households, in the Queen's own chamber, the Knollys presence was felt everywhere. This was no accident. Catherine and her husband understood the currency of kinship. A large brood meant influence spread wide, alliances multiplied, loyalties interwoven like threads in a tapestry. Some families fell into ruin because they lacked heirs, but Catherine ensured that her line would never fade. Her 16 children were not only her personal achievement, but also her family's strategy for survival. They became ambassadors of the Knollys name, carriers of Boleyn blood, figures who reminded the world that Catherine Carey's legacy was not to be dismissed. Yet there was always the question that lingered in the background. Was Catherine herself a daughter of Henry VIII? If so, then each of her children carried royal blood far closer to the throne than official records admitted. Did Elizabeth look upon her cousin's children and see echoes of her father's line? Was that why she kept the Knollys clan so close? Why she entrusted them with positions, favors, and responsibilities? It is impossible to know, for Elizabeth never spoke of such things openly. But the rumor lingered, whispered in corners, unspoken yet ever present. Catherine herself never claimed the connection, but perhaps in the quiet of night, as she cradled her newborns, she wondered if their blood was touched by kingship. As her children grew, Catherine's life remained tied to Elizabeth. In her role as chief lady of the bedchamber, she witnessed the Queen's most private moments, guarded her secrets, and provided companionship in an existence otherwise lonely and burdened by power. Catherine was more than a servant. She was a confidant, a relative, perhaps even the closest thing to a sister Elizabeth ever allowed herself to have. And in that role she lived within the beating heart of Tudor politics, a witness to every whisper, every plan, every triumph and failure. Her children, spread across the court, expanded her influence even further, forming an invisible web that connected her womb to the fate of the realm. The burden of so many children was not only physical, but emotional. For every son or daughter who thrived, another carried risk. Smallpox, fever, the plague that periodically swept through London, all were threats that hung over her household. Catherine must have known the constant anxiety of watching her children cough in the night, of placing cool cloths upon fevered brows, of fearing that dawn would bring silence instead of breath. The nursery was as much a place of love as it was a place of dread. In those years, when even princes and queens fell to illness, no child was safe, no mother ever free of worry. By the late 1560s, Catherine was weary. The years of service at court, the endless cycle of childbearing, the strain of managing a household bursting with offspring, all had taken their toll. When she died in 1569, she left behind not only her husband and her children, but a queen who mourned as though she had lost part of herself. Elizabeth, so often accused of being cold and unyielding, broke with her usual composure. She ordered Catherine's funeral to be held at Westminster Abbey, a rare and extraordinary honor for someone not of royal rank. The grandeur of the ceremony testified to Elizabeth's affection and grief, as though she wished the world to understand that Catherine Carey had been more than a cousin, more than a servant. She had been a pillar of loyalty, of endurance, of kinship. In that moment, Elizabeth's sorrow revealed what history often conceals, the profound bonds that tied women together in a world built to exploit them. Looking at Catherine's 16 children, one sees more than a list of names. One sees the living proof of her endurance, the evidence of a woman who gave everything to her family and her queen. Through them, she stretched her influence far beyond her own lifespan. They were scattered like seeds across the soil of England, each one sprouting into a branch of the Tudor world. They carried her legacy into battles of politics and passion, into marriages and rivalries, into the very heart of Elizabethan England. They were the children of Catherine Carey, and through them her story would never truly end. The story of Catherine Carey did not end with her burial in Westminster Abbey, for the children she bore carried her name into every corridor of Elizabethan power. 16 lives had issued from her body, each one a thread spun into the broader tapestry of England's destiny. To look at the reign of Elizabeth Thurn, without seeing the shadows of Catherine's brood, is to miss the invisible scaffolding upon which the Queen's world was built. They were everywhere, in Parliament, in noble households, in the Queen's chamber itself, and their presence reminded everyone that the Knollys family was no minor branch of the aristocracy, but a force tied by blood, rumor, and loyalty to the throne. Among all her children, it was Lettice Knollys who became the most infamous. Beautiful, spirited, and ambitious, she was the daughter who most embodied the fire of the Boleyn line. From the moment she entered court, men spoke of her charm and her wit, and Elizabeth, who prided herself on her own grace and magnetism, must have felt a tremor of rivalry. The Queen tolerated Lettice for a time, perhaps because she was Catherine's daughter, perhaps because she saw in her cousin the same intelligence that ran through their shared blood. But destiny drove Lettice into the arms of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, the man who had long occupied a place dangerously close to Elizabeth's heart. Their marriage, conducted in secret, was not only a scandal but a personal wound to the Queen. Elizabeth, who had endured betrayals and rivalries all her life, saw in this act not just disobedience, but a usurpation of the affection she considered uniquely hers. Lettice was banished from court, her presence forbidden in the Queen's company. And yet the marriage endured, proving that Catherine's children were not pawns easily discarded, but players who could defy even the Virgin Queen herself. The scandal of Lettice's marriage was more than a family quarrel. It was a political storm. Dudley was the most powerful nobleman in England, the Queen's favorite, the man many thought she might one day marry. For him to wed the daughter of Carey meant the Knollys family had suddenly placed themselves in the very center of the Queen's most intimate circle. Elizabeth's fury was not only emotional, it was a recognition of the dangerous proximity of the Knollys bloodline to her throne. Some whispered again of Catherine's paternity, suggesting that if she had been Henry VIII's daughter, then Lettice herself carried royal blood. In marrying Dudley, was she not creating a rival dynasty, a union that might one day challenge Elizabeth's authority? Whether or not this was true, the Queen never forgave Lettice, and their estrangement lasted until Elizabeth's death. In Lettice, the legacy of Carey burst into open defiance, a reminder that the children she bore could shape the course of history as boldly as any monarch. While Lettice stirred scandal, Catherine's sons pursued paths of politics and service. Henry Knollys, her eldest, entered Parliament, his speeches measured and his presence steady. He was not a man of flamboyance, but he was reliable, a figure whose loyalty was never questioned. William Knollys climbed higher, eventually ennobled as the Earl of Banbury, his career a testament to the slow but relentless climb of the Knollys fortunes. Francis, the younger son who had shown a fiery temper in Parliament, became known for his sharp tongue and his unyielding positions. He embodied the assertiveness of a man who had inherited his mother's unspoken resilience, carrying into the chamber the vigor she had spent her life suppressing in silence. Their careers were not without risk. The Elizabethan court was a treacherous place, filled with factions and rivalries that could bring sudden ruin. Yet the Knollys sons survived and often thrived, in part because Elizabeth could never entirely cast them aside. They were her kin, and whether she admitted it or not, she needed them. Catherine's children had become her eyes and ears, her servants and advisers, her companions and her tools. Through them, Catherine's legacy remained alive within the Queen's reign, whispering from every corner of power. Other daughters of Catherine also found places within the Queen's household. Margaret and Elizabeth Knollys both served as ladies-in-waiting, their presence constant reminders of the mother who had once attended Elizabeth with unwavering devotion. Their names were spoken in the corridors of Whitehall, their faces familiar in the Queen's retinue. In their service one could see the continuation of Catherine's role, as though her spirit lingered in the rooms she had once inhabited, now embodied in the daughters who followed her path. They were loyal, discreet, and reliable, and Elizabeth valued them even when the shadow of their sister Lettice cast a pall over the family name. Yet, even as her children's fortunes unfolded, the memory of Catherine's suffering lingered in every life they lived. 16 times she had endured the risks of childbirth. 16 times she had faced the possibility of death. And though she had lived through them, the toll was undeniable. Her body must have carried the scars of her endurance, the quiet pain of a life spent as a vessel for dynastic ambition. Tudor medicine offered little comfort, no real remedies for the exhaustion, the fevers, the tearing that came with childbirth. Every time she rose from her bed, it was a triumph of will as much as of health. Her survival into middle age was nothing short of extraordinary, and yet it was taken for granted, expected as part of her duty. In the eyes of society, her worth was measured by the children she produced, and produce them she did. But behind the tally of names and titles was a woman who had given every ounce of herself to her family and her queen. The suffering of Tudor women was not confined to the chamber of childbirth. It extended into the fabric of their lives. They were denied the freedom to choose their destinies, their marriages arranged, their bodies bound to the expectations of lineage and property. Catherine, despite her position and her closeness to the throne, was no exception. She was celebrated for her fertility, admired for her loyalty, and yet her personal desires, her inner life, are barely recorded. What did she dream of in the quiet moments, when the noise of the court receded and the children were asleep? Did she long for rest, for a life of her own making, for an existence not defined by duty? These are questions history cannot answer, but they remind us that beneath the layers of politics and legacy, Catherine was a human being who lived, loved, and suffered. Her children, however, ensured that her voice was not entirely silenced. Through them she continued to speak, not in words, but in influence, in marriages, in acts of defiance and loyalty. Lettice's marriage to Dudley was one voice, loud and scandalous, echoing across the court. William's earldom was another, steady and legitimizing. Francis's parliamentary fire was yet another, bold and unyielding. Together they formed a chorus that carried Catherine's legacy into every chamber of Elizabethan power. They were the embodiment of her endurance, the living proof of her sacrifices. As the years of Elizabeth's reign stretched on, the Knollys family remained ever present, sometimes in favor, sometimes in disgrace, but never irrelevant. Elizabeth's anger at Lettice did not extend to all her siblings, for the Queen could not afford to alienate the entire family. In this balance of wrath and necessity, one sees again the invisible hand of Carey, guiding the fortunes of her children even from the grave. Her memory lingered in Elizabeth's mind, a reminder of the loyalty she had once known, a loyalty that bound the Queen even when anger tempted her to sever ties. The Knollys presence also underscored the strange paradox of Elizabeth's reign. The Queen who styled herself the Virgin Queen was surrounded by the offspring of a woman who had embodied fertility to an almost legendary degree. 16 children stood as living evidence of what Elizabeth herself had denied: the continuation of bloodlines, the weaving of kinship into dynastic security. Where Elizabeth refused to marry and bear children, Catherine had done so to an extreme. Together, their stories formed two poles of Tudor womanhood, one defined by the absence of heirs, the other by an abundance. And between them stretched the complicated truth of what it meant to be a woman in a world ruled by men and haunted by the shadow of succession. For the Knollys children, their mother's story was both a source of pride and a burden. They carried the whispers of her rumored paternity, the speculation that their grandmother, Mary Boleyn, had given more to Henry VIII than history cared to record. They bore the advantages of their connection to Elizabeth, yet they also bore the risks of being too close, too ambitious, too bold. Lettice's fall from favor was proof of how swiftly Elizabeth could turn, how dangerous it was to overstep. But even in that fall, the Knollys family endured. They were too numerous, too widespread, too essential to be erased. Catherine's womb had given them resilience. Her sacrifices had secured their place, and her memory ensured their survival. In contemplating Catherine Carey's children, one sees the breadth of her legacy. They were not saints, nor were they merely pawns. They were individuals who shaped the Elizabethan world, who carried forward the complexities of their mother's life. They were evidence of her suffering, but also of her triumph. For though history often reduces women to footnotes, Catherine's story resists silence. 16 children cannot be ignored. A position at the Queen's side cannot be erased. A funeral at Westminster Abbey cannot be forgotten. Her life, with all its burdens and sacrifices, insists upon recognition, even centuries later. And so her story lingers, woven into the reign of Elizabeth, etched into the scandal of Lettice, echoed in the speeches of Francis, remembered in the titles of William, preserved in the service of Margaret and Elizabeth, whispered in the marriages of Anne and Catherine, and mourned in the short lives of the children she lost. Catherine Carey, the mother of 16, the cousin of a queen, the possible daughter of a king, stands as a testament to the hidden power of women in Tudor England. Power not always wielded in crowns or proclamations, but in endurance, in survival, and in the quiet shaping of generations that would carry her name far beyond her grave. Even in death, Catherine Carey's presence lingered in the lives of her children. As the 1580s unfolded, the world that Elizabeth ruled grew ever more dangerous. Spain loomed as an enemy across the sea, religion continued to tear at the fabric of England, and plots against the Queen's life seemed to multiply with every passing year. Into this climate stepped Catherine's sons, men who had been raised in the shadow of their mother's quiet resilience and their father's stern Protestant loyalty. They had inherited not only her blood, but also her position, for Elizabeth's reliance upon the Knollys family deepened as threats closed in around her. Sir Francis Knollys the Younger emerged as a voice of forceful Protestant conviction in Parliament. He spoke with the sharp edge of a man who believed in divine providence and the urgency of protecting England against papal power. His speeches carried echoes of the sacrifices his mother had made, for his passion seemed fueled by a sense of destiny, as though he knew he carried within him the blood of more than one dynasty. He was relentless, unafraid to challenge rivals, unyielding in his belief that Elizabeth's reign was both sacred and precarious. His words added to the chorus that demanded vigilance against Spain, preparing the kingdom for the storm that was to come. William Knollys, who had risen steadily in Elizabeth's favor, became a fixture at court. He cultivated the image of a loyal nobleman, a man who could be trusted with both military and political responsibility. His eventual title, Earl of Banbury, marked the recognition of the Knollys family's enduring importance. But titles were not merely honors. They were signals that Catherine's children had secured for themselves a place among the great peers of the realm. William carried himself with dignity, a reminder that the sacrifices of his mother's body had not been in vain. Every step he took at court was a step she had enabled through her 16 journeys into childbirth. Meanwhile, Lettice Knollys, still banished from the Queen's presence, carved out her own path. Though Elizabeth would not forgive her for marrying Robert Dudley, Lettice remained a formidable figure. She bore Dudley a son, Robert, known as the Noble Imp, who briefly embodied the possibility of a future dynasty that might challenge Elizabeth's own carefully constructed virgin image. But the boy died young, snatched away as so many Tudor children were, leaving Lettice to carry both the burden of scandal and the sorrow of loss. Catherine, had she lived, would have known this grief too well. She had seen her own children die in infancy, felt the hollow ache of loss that no mother could ever forget. In Lettice's sorrow was an echo of Catherine's own suffering, passed from mother to daughter across the divide of death. The Spanish Armada of 1588 tested England as no trial had before, while Elizabeth stood at Tilbury in her famous armor, rallying her troops with words that would echo for centuries. The sons of Catherine Carey were among those who bore the weight of defending the realm. They commanded men, served in Parliament, and shouldered responsibility in the machinery of war. For them, the defense of England was not only a duty to their queen, but a legacy of their mother's loyalty. Catherine had given her life to Elizabeth in service and sacrifice, and her sons gave theirs in courage and leadership. Their presence in those years reminded the kingdom that the Knollys family, though born of whispers and scandal, had become indispensable to England's survival. But the glory of war did not erase the burdens of family. The Knollys clan, with its 16 branches, was a sprawling web of alliances, marriages, and rivalries. Catherine's daughters had been scattered into noble households, each one serving as a thread connecting the family to other great names. Margaret married into the Leightons, Elizabeth into the Levisons, Anne into the Wests, and Catherine into the Vaughans. Through these unions, Catherine's children spread her legacy further, tying her line to counties across England. Each marriage was more than love. It was strategy, survival, and expansion. Catherine herself had once been used as a pawn in marriage, and now her daughters followed the same path. Their lives were measured by the children they bore, and the alliances they forged, just as their mothers had been. The specter of scandal, however, never left the family. Lettice's marriage to Dudley had forever altered the way the Queen looked upon the Knollys brood. Elizabeth, though pragmatic, could never fully separate her personal resentment from her political calculations. When she saw Catherine's children at court, she must have remembered the cousin who had served her faithfully, the woman she had buried with honors at Westminster. But she also must have felt the sting of betrayal, the reminder that Catherine's womb had produced not only loyal servants, but rivals to her affection and authority. This paradox defined the Knollys relationship with Elizabeth: loved yet mistrusted, indispensable yet resented, kin yet potential adversaries. The later years of Elizabeth's reign were marked by weariness. The Queen aged, her court grew restless, and the question of succession loomed larger with every passing year. Catherine's children, now adults in their own right, maneuvered within this tense atmosphere. They had to balance loyalty to Elizabeth with preparation for what might come after her death. For if Elizabeth left no heir, as seemed increasingly likely, the throne would pass to James of Scotland, a king whose policies and personality might not favor those who had thrived under Elizabeth. Catherine's sons and daughters positioned themselves carefully, mindful that the loyalty of one generation might not secure the favor of the next. Through all of this, the memory of Catherine Carey hovered like a ghost. She had been the quiet force who gave Elizabeth companionship, who gave the Knollys family its foundation, who had endured 16 childbirths to populate the court with sons and daughters who would carry her influence beyond her grave. When Elizabeth looked at William, Francis, or Margaret, she could not help but see the reflection of the woman who had once stood at her bedside, who had once guarded her secrets. And perhaps, in moments of solitude, the Queen remembered Catherine not as a political ally, but as the cousin who might also have been a sister, if the rumors of her parentage were true. That unspoken possibility colored every interaction, lending the Knollys family a mystique that no title or office could replicate. The 1590s brought more turbulence. Robert Dudley's death in 1588 had left Lettice a widow, her scandalous marriage at last concluded by fate. She remarried again to Sir Christopher Blount, a soldier and conspirator, and once more found herself entangled in political storms. When Blount joined the ill-fated rebellion of the Earl of Essex in 1601, Lettice's fortunes fell into peril. She was spared the scaffold, but the shadow of treason clung to her name. Elizabeth, still unforgiving, must have looked upon her cousin's daughter with a mix of anger and pity, a reminder that Catherine's line had produced both loyalty and defiance in equal measure. The sons of Catherine Carey, however, maintained their positions. William, as Earl of Banbury, held status and influence, a stabilizing presence in the later court. Francis continued his parliamentary career, his voice still sharp, though tempered by age. Their survival in a time of shifting allegiances was no small achievement, for many noble families rose and fell with the tides of Elizabeth's moods. The Knollys family, however, endured, their resilience born of the woman who had given them life, and the queen who could never wholly cast them aside. What strikes us most, looking at this period, is the contrast between Elizabeth and Catherine. The queen, determined to remain a virgin and a symbol of independence, bore no children, leaving her dynasty without direct heirs. Catherine, by contrast, had borne 16, filling the court with her offspring, spreading her legacy across the kingdom. The Virgin Queen and the mother of 16 stood as mirrors of one another, embodying two extremes of Tudor womanhood. One denied the expectations of her sex, using her virginity as a tool of power. The other fulfilled those expectations to their fullest, her body a vessel for dynastic survival. And yet, both were bound to the same throne, their fates intertwined in ways history cannot fully unravel. By the end of the century, the Knollys name was firmly established. They had survived scandal, war, rebellion, and the capricious favor of a queen. They had become part of the furniture of Elizabethan England, unavoidable and enduring. And through them, Catherine Carey's memory lived on, not as a figure of grandeur, but as a woman whose sacrifices had shaped a dynasty. She had not worn a crown, yet her children sat in the halls of power. She had not written proclamations, yet her blood flowed through the voices that spoke in Parliament. She had not commanded armies, yet her sons marched beneath banners raised in Elizabeth's name. Her influence was quiet, almost invisible, but no less real than that of the monarch she served. And so, as the Elizabethan age moved toward its twilight, Catherine's story remained woven into the kingdom's fate. She was gone, yet her presence lingered in every scandal, every triumph, every political maneuver her children enacted. The Virgin Queen could not escape the shadow of the mother of 16, for Catherine Carey had given Elizabeth not only companionship in life, but a legacy in death. Her endurance, her suffering, her sacrifice had produced a generation that shaped the destiny of England, carrying forward the paradox of loyalty and rivalry, service and defiance, kinship and suspicion. Catherine's children were her monument, living proof that even in an age that sought to silence women, one woman's body could change the course of history. As the final decade of Elizabeth's reign unfolded, England itself seemed to age with her. The Queen, who had once dazzled Europe with her wit and her vigor, now carried the lines of time upon her face. Her fiery hair dulled beneath wigs, her body weakened by the years, yet she clung fiercely to her throne, unwilling to yield, unwilling to name the successor who would inherit her crown. Around her, courtiers whispered, factions schemed, and the air grew heavy with uncertainty. And through it all, the children of Catherine Carey remained at the heart of the court, their lives still shaped by the sacrifices of a mother long buried in Westminster Abbey. William Knollys, Earl of Banbury, had by now cemented his place among the nobility. He was no mere courtier, but a peer of the realm, his authority acknowledged, his influence steady. He had weathered the storms of scandal and politics, his loyalty to Elizabeth never in doubt. Yet he, like all of his generation, knew that the Queen's reign could not last forever. His eyes turned toward the horizon, toward Scotland, where James VI awaited the call that would bring him to London as James I of England. William's position was secure, but the world was shifting, and he had to prepare his family to move with it. Francis Knollys the Younger continued to raise his voice in Parliament, his speeches ringing with urgency as England confronted the challenges of succession, religion, and foreign threat. He was older now, tempered by decades of debate, but his passion had not dimmed. In his words, one could hear the echo of the resilience his mother had embodied, the same iron will that had carried her through 16 childbirths, the same quiet strength that had once stood by Elizabeth's side. Francis may never have realized how much of Catherine lived on in him, but those who knew him could not have missed it. Lettice Knollys, ever the figure of scandal and survival, entered her later years with a reputation both infamous and fascinating. She had outlived Robert Dudley, the love of Elizabeth's life, and married again, only to see her third husband executed for treason after the Earl of Essex's rebellion. Yet even then she endured, unbroken, carrying herself with the pride of a woman who had defied a queen and lived to tell the tale. In her beauty, her ambition, and her capacity for survival, she was her mother's daughter, though she lacked Catherine's quiet discretion. Lettice made her mark in defiance, where Catherine had done so in silence. But both women carried within them the same indomitable spirit, the same refusal to be erased. The younger children of Catherine had by now woven themselves into the noble fabric of England. Margaret, Elizabeth, Anne, and Catherine had secured their families through marriage, their descendants spreading Catherine's blood even further. Robert, Richard, and Thomas had lived their shorter lives with varying fortunes, some cut down by illness, others by the hazards of a world where death was never far away. But taken together, the Knollys children stood as a living testament to their mother's endurance. They were 16 branches from a single trunk, each one carrying her legacy into corners of the kingdom she herself had never seen. And above them all loomed Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, now in the twilight of her reign. The paradox between Catherine and her cousin grew sharper with every passing year. Catherine had borne more children than almost any noblewoman of her age, while Elizabeth had borne none. Catherine had given her body to the endless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, sacrificing her health and her strength. Elizabeth had sacrificed her chance at marriage and motherhood for the sake of her crown, choosing instead to wield her body as a symbol of virginity and independence. Between them lay the full spectrum of Tudor womanhood, the mother of 16 and the mother of none, one who served through fertility, the other who ruled through abstinence. Both suffered, both endured, and both left legacies that shaped the destiny of England. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the great question of succession was finally answered. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed James I of England, uniting the crowns in a single monarch. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun with Henry VII more than a century earlier, came to its end, giving way to the Stuart line. For the Knollys family, the transition was fraught with uncertainty, but they endured as they always had. The loyalty they had shown to Elizabeth did not vanish with her death. Instead, they adapted, their positions secured by the web of marriages, titles, and services Catherine had set in motion decades before. Her children and grandchildren found places in the new regime, carrying her legacy forward into a new age. The memory of Catherine Carey lingered even then. Her funeral at Westminster Abbey had marked her as someone more than ordinary, someone whose life mattered not just to her family, but to the Queen herself. Elizabeth's tears had revealed what history often conceals, that Catherine was not only a cousin, not only a servant, but a presence woven into the fabric of Elizabeth's soul. If the rumors of Catherine's paternity were true, if she had indeed been the daughter of Henry VIII, then Elizabeth's grief was not only for a cousin, but for a sister, the only one who had shared her father's blood and her mother's fate. That secret, unspoken yet powerful, may have been the reason Elizabeth honored Catherine so deeply, the reason she kept her children close even when scandal threatened to drive them away. The truth remains hidden, locked within the shadows of history, but the suspicion itself adds a haunting depth to Catherine's story. For all her sacrifices, Catherine Carey left no writings, no personal reflections to tell us her thoughts. What survives are fragments, records of her marriage, the names of her children, glimpses of her service to the Queen, and the grandeur of her funeral. Yet from these fragments a portrait emerges, not of a silent pawn, but of a woman whose endurance shaped the course of history. Her 16 children were not only her duty, but her monument, a living testament to her strength. Through them she influenced Parliament, the nobility, the very heart of Elizabeth's court. Through them she carried forward the blood of the Boleyns, the whispers of the Tudors, and the resilience of women who survived in a world that often sought to erase them. To imagine Catherine's life is to imagine the chamber of childbirth repeated again and again, the screams muffled by walls that heard them too often, the sweat and blood-staining sheets that would soon be washed and prepared for the next ordeal. It is to imagine her lying awake in the night, listening for the cries of an infant, fearing the silence that might come instead. It is to imagine her walking the corridors of court, her body weary, her spirit tired, yet her face composed, her demeanor loyal, her role fulfilled. It is to imagine her standing by Elizabeth's side, adjusting the Queen's garments, whispering reassurances, carrying secrets that could never be spoken aloud. It is to imagine her buried in Westminster, her body at rest at last, while her children carried her forward into history. And in the end, Catherine Carey forces us to ask what it meant to be a woman in Tudor England. Was power measured only in crowns and titles, or was there power too in survival, in endurance, in the quiet strength of a mother who bore 16 children and lived to see them shape a kingdom? Catherine never ruled, yet she influenced rulers. She never commanded armies, yet her sons stood in Parliament and on the fields of battle. She never married for love, yet through her marriages and her children, she forged alliances that secured her family's survival. She lived not in the spotlight of history, but in its shadows, and yet those shadows are as essential to the story of England as the brilliance of the throne itself. Her life is a paradox, a woman both privileged and imprisoned, exalted and forgotten, honored and overlooked. She was cousin, confidant, servant, mother, perhaps even the secret daughter of a king. She was Catherine Carey, the woman who gave everything and received so little, the mother of 16 who stood silently beside the Virgin Queen, the ghost who lingers in the halls of Westminster, reminding us that history is not only written by those who ruled, but also by those who endured. Her story is one of suffering, sacrifice, and survival, but also of triumph, for in the end she shaped a dynasty, carried a kingdom, and left behind a legacy that time could never erase. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.